The transport ship broke through the clouds of Nexus Prime, and Marcus Cole pressed his face against the window like a child seeing snow for the first time, his breath fogging the glass as the massive structure of the Galactic Academy came into view below him, a sprawling complex of towers and domes that stretched across an entire continent, home to the most prestigious military and diplomatic institution in the entire Orion arm of the galaxy. He was 19 years old, born on Europa in a cramped colony dome where humans had scratched out a living for 3 generations. And now he was one of only 3 humans ever admitted to this place, where young beings from over 200 species came to train as officers and diplomats and warriors. Though most of those species had been traveling between stars for thousands of years, while humanity had only discovered faster-than-light travel 3 centuries ago. The other passengers on the transport barely glanced at him, and Marcus understood why, because to them he was nothing more than a curiosity, a representative of what they called a juvenile species, clever enough to figure out basic technology but physically unremarkable and completely lacking in the psychic abilities that many older species took for granted. When the transport landed and Marcus stepped onto the platform with his single bag of belongings, he felt the weight of 1,000 alien eyes upon him, some curious and some dismissive and some openly hostile. But he kept his head high and walked toward the registration building because his mother had always told him that the universe only respects those who respect themselves first. The registration process took hours, and Marcus found himself shuffled from one office to another, answering questions and submitting to scans and filling out forms in 3 different languages, until finally a floating drone led him to his assigned quarters in the residential tower, a small room with a bed and a desk and a window that looked out over the training grounds where students practiced combat with weapons and powers that Marcus could barely comprehend. He had just finished unpacking his few possessions when he heard laughter in the hallway outside his door. Not friendly laughter, but the sharp, mocking kind that he remembered from his childhood, when the older kids in the colony would corner the smaller ones and make them cry for entertainment. Marcus opened his door and found himself face to face with a group of aliens, and at their center stood the most striking being he had ever seen, a female of the Kethvari species who towered over him by at least a foot. Her 4 arms crossed over her chest, and her scales shimmering with colors that shifted from green to gold as she looked down at him with eyes that held nothing but contempt. "So this is the human," she said, and her voice carried the accent of old money and older bloodlines, the kind of voice that expected obedience and received it without question. "I am Lady Vixara of House Kethmora, and I wanted to welcome our new primitive neighbor to the Academy." Her entourage laughed again, and Marcus felt his face grow hot, but he refused to look away from her because showing weakness to a predator only invited attack. "I brought you a gift," Vixara continued, and one of her 4 hands reached behind her back and produced something wrapped in old cloth. "A weapon suited for one of your kind." She thrust the bundle toward him, and Marcus caught it automatically. And when the cloth fell away, he found himself holding a sword, though calling it a sword was generous, because it was little more than a corroded piece of black metal, covered in rust and grime. The blade pitted and dull, and the hilt wrapped in what might have once been leather but now crumbled at his touch. "My ancestors took this from a dead world 10,000 years ago," Vixara said with a smile that showed all of her pointed teeth. "It has been sitting in our vault collecting dust ever since, because no one in my family would ever lower themselves to touch such a primitive weapon. But I thought perhaps you might appreciate it since your species still fights with sticks and stones." More laughter from her followers, and Vixara turned and walked away without another word, leaving Marcus standing in his doorway holding a piece of ancient junk, while the other students whispered and pointed at him. He should have thrown it away, should have tossed it in the recycler, and forgotten about the whole humiliating encounter. But something stopped him, some instinct that whispered in the back of his mind that there was more to this rusted blade than met the eye. That night, alone in his quarters with the door locked and the lights dimmed, Marcus sat on his bed and examined the sword more closely, running his fingers over the corroded surface and wondering what world it had come from and what hands had held it before his own. And then his bare palm touched the hilt, and everything changed. The rust fell away like ash, blown by a sudden wind, revealing metal so black it seemed to drink the light around it. And along the length of the blade, ancient symbols began to glow with a golden fire that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, growing brighter and brighter until the entire room was filled with light. Marcus felt something awaken inside him. A connection that ran deeper than bone and blood, as if the sword had been waiting for him across all the long centuries, waiting for his touch and his touch alone. And when he raised the blade, he knew with absolute certainty that it would never answer to anyone else. The humming filled his ears, a sound that was almost like music, and the visions came then, flashes of memory that did not belong to him. Images of towering beings with skin like starlight wielding blades just like this one, against an enemy made of shadow and hunger, a war fought across galaxies and ages, a sacrifice made to save everything that lived. He did not know how long he sat there lost in the visions, but when he finally returned to himself, the sword had grown quiet and the symbols had dimmed to a soft glow. And Marcus realized that his life had just changed in ways he could not yet understand. Deep beneath the academy, in chambers that had not been opened since before the Kethvari had first learned to make fire, an ancient computer system stirred to life for the first time in 10,000 years, its sensors detecting something that should have been impossible, and it sent a single message to the headmaster's private terminal. The message contained only 7 words that would reshape the future of the galaxy. Wielder detected. The last ember has chosen. The summons came at dawn when Marcus had barely slept, his mind still spinning with the visions the sword had shown him, and the message on his terminal was simple and direct, ordering him to report to the headmaster's office immediately and to bring the weapon with him. He walked through corridors filled with students who stared and whispered as he passed, because word had already spread through the academy like fire through dry grass, the story of the human and the glowing sword growing more fantastic with each retelling until Marcus barely recognized the events of the previous night. The headmaster's office occupied the highest floor of the central tower, and when Marcus stepped through the doors, he found himself in a chamber that seemed to stretch into infinity, the walls covered with star maps and artifacts from 1,000 worlds. And at the center of it all sat Headmaster Zorvan. Marcus had seen images of the headmaster during his orientation materials, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of standing in the presence of one of the oldest beings in the quadrant, a towering figure made entirely of living crystal, light refracting through his body in patterns that hurt to look at directly, his face a collection of geometric planes that somehow conveyed wisdom and age beyond human comprehension. "Show me the blade," Zorvan said, and his voice resonated through the chamber like the ringing of great bells. Marcus drew the sword from the wrapping he had carried it in, and the moment his hand touched the hilt, the symbols blazed to life once more, filling the office with golden radiance. And he heard Zorvan make a sound that might have been a gasp of surprise or wonder or fear. "In all my centuries, I never believed I would see such a thing," the headmaster said, rising from his seat and moving closer to examine the weapon without touching it. "This is a void-forged blade, one of 7 legendary weapons created by the Precursors, a species that vanished from the universe 1,000,000 years ago after fighting a war against an enemy so terrible that most records of it have been lost or destroyed." "The visions," Marcus said. "I saw them. Tall beings with skin like starlight fighting against something made of darkness. The Precursors created these weapons to fight the Hollow," Zorvan explained. "Entities from between dimensions that consume the life force of everything they touch, leaving only empty shells behind. And for 100,000 years, the precursors held them back until finally they sacrificed themselves to seal the hollow away forever. He paused and looked at Marcus with those crystalline eyes that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the soul beneath. These blades can only be awakened by beings with a specific resonance frequency, a bioelectric pattern in their neural pathways that matches the precursor technology. And in all of recorded history, no species has ever been able to activate one, not the Kethvari with their ancient bloodlines, not the crystalline elders with our connection to the fundamental forces of the universe, not any of the hundreds of species that have tried over the millennia. But I did, Marcus said. Why me? Why humanity? Zorvan turned to his console and activated a holographic display that filled the chamber with images and text in a language that seemed to shift and change as Marcus looked at it. When you awakened the blade, it unlocked archives that have been sealed since the precursors vanished. And what those archives reveal has shaken everything I thought I knew about the history of intelligent life in this galaxy. The display changed to show an image of Earth, blue and green and beautiful, spinning slowly in the void. Humanity was not a random evolutionary accident, Zorvan said. The precursors created you, seeded your world with genetic material designed to produce a species with neural patterns compatible with their technology, a contingency plan in case the Hollow ever broke free from their prison. A last line of defense for the galaxy. Marcus felt the floor shift beneath his feet as the implications crashed over him like a wave. His entire species reduced to a weapon created by beings who had died before humans had even learned to use fire. We were made to be tools, he said, and the bitterness in his voice surprised him. You were made to be inheritors, Zorvan corrected gently. The precursors knew they would not survive the final battle, and they wanted to ensure that their legacy and their mission would continue. They chose your species not because you were expendable, but because they saw something in humanity that gave them hope. The display changed again to show images of humans throughout history, building and creating and fighting and loving and dying. A species that had clawed its way up from caves to the stars in the blink of an eye compared to the time scales of galactic civilization. You are adaptable and resilient and stubborn beyond all reason, Zorvan said. You form bonds with anything and everything. You refuse to accept impossible odds. You find hope in the darkest moments. These are the qualities the precursors valued. These are the qualities that might save us all. Save us from what? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer, had seen it in the visions the sword had shown him, writhing darkness that hungered for the light. The seal is weakening, Zorvan said. We have detected anomalies at the edge of the galaxy, disappearances and strange readings that match the descriptions in the precursor archives. The Hollow are coming, and you may be the only one who can stop them. Over the following weeks, Marcus trained harder than he had ever trained in his life, working with blade singer Kethis, an insectoid weapons master with compound eyes and mandibles that clicked when he was frustrated, which was often because Marcus was not a natural warrior and the sword did not respond to physical strength but to willpower and intention. But slowly he learned, discovering that the blade could cut through energy shields as easily as air, could phase through solid matter when he willed it to, could show him glimpses of the future in the heat of combat, and each night he fell into his bed exhausted, but knowing that he was becoming something more than the scared colony kid who had arrived at the academy weeks ago. The other students watched him with new eyes now, some with curiosity and some with resentment, and a few from species with old legends about the precursors looked at him with something like religious awe. But Vixara watched him with hatred that burned hotter each day. Her joke turned to ash in her mouth as the human she had mocked became the center of galactic attention. And far away in the darkness between stars, something ancient stirred in its prison, sensing the light of the ember burning once more, and for the first time in 1,000,000 years the Hollow began to wake. 3 months had passed since Marcus first awakened the blade. 3 months of training and studying and learning to become the warrior the galaxy apparently needed him to be, and he had almost convinced himself that the threat Zorvan spoke of was still distant, still something he had time to prepare for. He was wrong. The alert came in the middle of the night, a piercing alarm that dragged Marcus from sleep and sent students running through the corridors in confusion, and by the time he reached the command center with his sword strapped to his back, Zorvan was already coordinating response teams with a grim expression on his crystalline face. "Research station, Theta on the far moon has gone silent," the headmaster explained without preamble. The last transmission was a single word repeated over and over, a word that has not been spoken in the common tongue for 1,000,000 years. "What word?" Marcus asked, though the cold spreading through his chest told him he already knew. "Hollow." The response team consisted of 12 of the Academy's best fighters, along with Marcus, and they took a fast shuttle to the moon, a barren rock covered with sensor arrays and research facilities. And as they approached the station, Marcus saw that all the lights were dark, and the landing beacon was offline. They found the first body just inside the airlock, a HFY scientist still wearing her laboratory coat. And at first, Marcus thought she was simply dead. But when he looked closer, he saw the truth, and had to fight to keep from being sick. She was hollow, her body intact, but everything inside gone. No bones or organs or blood, just an empty shell of scales and skin that collapsed when one of the soldiers accidentally brushed against it. And her eyes were open and staring at nothing, 2 dark pits where something had been torn out by force. They found more bodies as they moved deeper into the station. 37 researchers and security personnel reduced to hollow shells, and the security footage they recovered showed what had killed them. Shadows that moved against the light, shapes that hurt to look at, entities that flowed through walls and floors and dragged screaming victims into darkness before leaving their empty remains behind. "The Hollow are not a species," Zorvan explained later when the team had returned and the full council of the Academy had been assembled. "They are an absence, a hunger from between dimensions that consumes the life force of all living things and uses the empty shells as vessels to walk in our reality. They cannot be killed by conventional weapons because they are not truly alive in any way we understand." "Then how did the precursors defeat them?" asked Admiral Keth Tar, a scarred veteran of a dozen wars who commanded the Academy's defense forces. "They created the void-forged blades," Zorvan said. "Weapons forged in the heart of dying stars and infused with the light of creation itself. The only things in the universe that can permanently destroy a hollow. And they fought a war that lasted 100,000 years until finally they sacrificed their entire species to seal the breach between dimensions." All eyes turned to Marcus, and he felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him like a physical force. "One sword against an army of shadows," he said quietly. "How am I supposed to fight that alone?" "You will not be alone," came a voice from the doorway, and Marcus turned to see Vixara standing there with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Fear mixed with determination and something that might have been shame. She walked into the chamber and stopped in front of Marcus, her 4 arms hanging at her sides rather than crossed in their usual posture of arrogance. And when she spoke, her voice was soft enough that only he could hear. "3 of my friends died on that moon," she said. "I mocked you and gave you that sword as a joke, and now I understand that my ancestors took it from a world they fled, a world consumed by living shadows. My family has carried the memory of that terror for 10,000 years, and I passed it to you wrapped in cruelty because I was afraid." She lowered her head in a gesture of submission that Marcus knew cost her more than she would ever admit. "I am sorry, and I offer you the archives of my house. Everything my ancestors knew about the Hollow and the world they escaped, if it will help you fight the darkness that is coming." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and then extended his hand in the human gesture of friendship, and after a hesitation, Vixara took it with one of her own hands, and something changed between them in that moment, old hostility giving way to the beginning of alliance. But there was no time for reconciliation because the sensors began screaming warnings that made even Zorvan pale, and when they looked at the view screen, they saw something that froze the blood of every being in the chamber. The stars were going out. Not all of them, but a patch of darkness was spreading across the sky above the academy, a void where no light existed, and at its center something was descending toward them. A shape so vast it blocked out entire constellations, a herald of the hollow, come to deliver a message to the beings who dared to light a fire in the dark. It did not speak with sound but with thought, its voice pressing into every mind on the station with a pressure that made the weaker students collapse and even the strongest fighters stagger under the weight of alien malice. "Return what you have stolen, little lights," the herald said, and its attention focused on Marcus like the gaze of a hungry god. "The ember you carry belongs to us. It was taken from the darkness, and to the darkness it must return. Surrender the blade, and we will make your ending swift." Marcus drew his sword, and the golden symbols blazed with defiance, and he felt the will of every precursor who had ever wielded a void-forged blade flowing through him. 1,000,000 years of courage and sacrifice and determination to protect the light from the endless dark. "Come and take it," he said. And the herald laughed, a sound like the death of stars, as its shadow fell upon the academy, and the true war began. The herald's first attack killed 200 beings and destroyed an entire wing of the academy before the defense shields drove it back into the darkness above. And as the survivors pulled bodies from the rubble and tended to the wounded, Marcus stood before the council and listened to Zorvan explain the only hope they had. 6 more void-forged blades exist, hidden across the galaxy by the precursors before their extinction, the headmaster said, his crystalline form dimmer than usual after the psychic assault of the herald's presence. "The archives awakened by Marcus's blade have revealed their locations, and if we can retrieve them, we may be able to create a force capable of fighting back against the Hollow. But only a human can awaken them," Admiral Kethtar said, "and we have only one human here." "That is true, but the archives also speak of a bonding ritual," Zorvan replied. "A human wielder can share their resonance with a worthy partner, passing on a fragment of their bioelectric signature and attuning the blade to respond to the new bearer. The precursors designed this failsafe because they knew that one species alone could not win this war." Marcus felt hope kindle in his chest for the first time since the attack, because he had been terrified that he would have to face the darkness alone, one young man against an army of shadows. But now there was a chance to build something greater. "I need a team," he said. "Warriors I can trust, beings willing to bond with the blades and fight beside me." Vixara stepped forward immediately, her scales shimmering with determination. "My family failed to awaken that blade for 10,000 years because we tried to claim it as a trophy rather than accepting it as a duty. I will not make that mistake again." Next came Torvax, a massive warrior from the Gorith species with thick gray skin and tusks that curved from his jaw like scimitars, a being who had openly mocked Marcus as a weakling during their first weeks at the academy, but who now stood at attention with respect in his deep-set eyes. "My people have a legend," he rumbled, "that one day a small light would rise from the darkness and lead the strong to glory. I thought it was a children's tale, but I was wrong. I will follow you, little light, and I will crush any shadow that stands in our path." The third volunteer surprised everyone. A small being, barely 3 feet tall with large ears and twitching whiskers, Zin of the Vexari species, engineers and tinkerers who were dismissed by the warrior races as too small and timid to matter. "The Hollow do not care about size or strength," Zin said in her high-pitched voice. "They consume all life equally, and my people have always survived by being clever and quick and willing to do what the big ones think is impossible. I will come with you." They left that night in a fast ship provided by the Admiral, racing against time toward the nearest hidden vault, while behind them the Herald gathered its forces for another assault on the Academy. The first vault was hidden in the heart of a dying star, accessible only through a narrow corridor of stable space that required Zin's engineering genius to navigate, and when they reached the chamber at the center, Marcus found a blade of deep crimson waiting on an altar of fused crystal. The awakening nearly killed him. When he touched the hilt, the sword drank from his life force like a man dying of thirst, and Marcus felt years of his life burning away as the blade ignited with hungry fire, and when it was over he could barely stand, but the crimson sword was blazing with power. He passed it to Torvax and performed the bonding ritual, pressing his palm against the Gorath's chest and willing a fragment of his resonance to flow into the massive warrior, and when Torvax gripped the blade, it responded to him as if he had been born to wield it. "I feel it," Torvax whispered with wonder in his voice. "The fire of stars in my hands." They found the second vault on an ice moon at the edge of the galaxy, and the third in the ruins of a precursor city deep beneath an ocean world. And each time Marcus paid the price of awakening with pieces of himself, growing weaker even as his allies grew stronger. The blade meant for Vixara was silver and elegant, matching her graceful fighting style, and when Marcus completed the bonding ritual, she wept, tears streaming down her scaled face as the sword blazed to life in her hands. "My ancestors searched for this for 10,000 years, she said. "They would have given anything to feel what I feel now. And it was never about bloodlines or worthiness or ancient claims. It was about being willing to fight together," Marcus said. And he meant it, because he had learned more about courage and sacrifice from these aliens who had once dismissed his species as primitive than he had ever learned from his own people. The fourth blade was meant for Zin, a small weapon that seemed almost like a dagger compared to the others. But in the tiny engineer's hands, it burned with a light fierce enough to rival any of them. "Size does not determine the brightness of one's fire," Zin said, with a grin that showed all her sharp little teeth. They raced back toward the academy, 4 warriors carrying weapons that could turn the tide of war. But as they dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Nexus Prime, they saw that they were too late. The Academy was burning. The Herald had breached the shields and descended with an army of lesser hollow, and even from orbit they could see the shadows flowing through the corridors of the institution that had stood for 100,000 years, consuming everything in their path. "We are too late," Vixara said, despair creeping into her voice. "No," Marcus said, gripping his sword tighter as the golden symbols blazed with defiance. "We are exactly on time. The darkness thinks it has won, but it has never faced anything like us before. It has never faced beings who chose to stand together." The ship dove toward the burning academy, 4 lights falling into the heart of darkness, and Marcus felt no fear, only the fierce joy of purpose as he prepared to bring fire to the endless night. They landed in the courtyard where Marcus had first arrived at the academy, the same stones now cracked and scorched, the same buildings now burning, and the shadows came for them immediately, a wave of darkness that screamed with the voices of the beings it had consumed. But the void-forged blades blazed like newborn stars, and where their light touched, the hollow burned away to nothing. Torvax roared and charged into the swarm with his crimson blade singing through the air, each strike destroying shadows that conventional weapons could not even touch, while Vixara danced through the chaos with deadly grace, her silver sword leaving trails of light that cut the darkness into pieces. Zin fought with the cunning of her people, using her small size to slip through gaps in the enemy formations and strike at shadows that never saw her coming, and Marcus led them all, his golden blade blazing brightest, as he carved a path toward the central tower where he could sense something terrible waiting. They found Headmaster Zorvan in the Great Hall, or what had once been Zorvan. Because the crystalline body that had commanded the academy for centuries was now filled with writhing darkness, the light that had once refracted through his form replaced by shadows that coiled and twisted beneath the surface. "Your precursors failed," the Hollow spoke with Zorvan's voice, a mockery of the wise being who had believed in Marcus when no one else would. "They threw everything they had against us, and in the end, they could only run and hide and seal us away with their dying breath. What makes you believe you will not fail as they did?" "Because we are not the precursors," Marcus said, raising his blade. "We are something new." The fight was brutal beyond anything Marcus had experienced, because Zorvan's crystalline body had been amplified by the Hollow's power. Moving faster than should have been possible and striking with force that sent Marcus crashing through walls with each blow. His allies tried to help, but the possessed headmaster seemed to be everywhere at once, batting aside Torvax with contemptuous ease, catching Vixara's blade and throwing her across the hall, crushing Zin beneath a fallen pillar before she could even react. Marcus fought alone against the monster that wore his mentor's face, and he was losing, his body battered and broken, his sword growing heavier with each swing, until finally a blow he could not dodge sent him to his knees with blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Yield," the Hollow commanded. "Give us the ember, and we will end this quickly." And in that moment of despair, the sword showed Marcus one final vision, the last memory of the precursors before they vanished from the universe. He saw them gathered on a world of glass and light, millions of beings who knew they were about to die, and he felt their decision as if it were his own, the choice to channel all of their collective life force through their weapons and into the barrier that would seal the Hollow away they had won. But the price had been extinction. The sword pulsed against his palm, and Marcus understood that it was offering him the same choice. He could reach out to every human in the galaxy, billions of minds all carrying the precursor resonance, and channel their energy through himself to destroy the Hollow forever. But the cost would be the same. Humanity would survive, but their spark would be extinguished. The resonance that made them special burned away until they were exactly what the other species had always believed them to be. Nothing remarkable, nothing special, just another primitive race crawling through the stars. "No," Marcus said, and he felt the sword pulse with confusion because no wielder had ever refused this offer before. "The precursors were wrong," he continued, pushing himself to his feet, even though every muscle screamed in protest. "They thought the only way to win was to sacrifice everything, but they forgot that the darkness cannot understand why we fight. It cannot understand love or hope or the choice to stand with others even when standing alone would be easier." He reached out with his mind, not to take from humanity, but to ask, broadcasting a signal through the resonance that connected him to every human across the galaxy. "I need your help," he said, and 7 billion minds heard him. Colonists on distant worlds and soldiers on warships and children in schools and elders in homes, all of them feeling his desperation and his hope. "Not your lives, just your light, just enough to push back the darkness one more time." And humanity answered. Not because they were programmed to, not because the precursors had designed them as weapons, but because when someone asks for help, you help them. When someone is fighting alone in the dark, you stand beside them, because that is what humans do. 7 billion points of light flowed into Marcus, not taken but freely given, and he did not burn because this fire was made of choice rather than sacrifice. Compassion rather than extinction. He blazed brighter than any star, and when he raised his sword, the golden symbols burned with the combined will of an entire species that had chosen to fight together. The Hollow screamed as Marcus drove his blade through Zorvan's crystalline heart, not to destroy the headmaster, but to burn the darkness out of him, and the light poured through the wound and spread through the great hall and up into the sky where the herald waited. The breach between dimensions shattered and reformed, not with death, but with the living fire of human defiance, a barrier stronger than the one the precursors had built, because it was made of hope rather than despair. The Hollow were banished, not forever but for generations, driven back into the darkness between worlds by a species they had dismissed as insignificant. Marcus collapsed as the light faded, his body exhausted beyond measure, but his spirit brighter than it had ever been. And when he woke 3 days later, he found Vexara sitting beside his bed with tears on her scaled face. "Zorvan survived," she told him. "The Hollow's corruption is gone, and the Academy still stands." "And the Hollow, sealed away," she said. "The scholars say the barrier will hold for 1,000 years at least, long enough for us to prepare, long enough for humanity to take its place among the elder races." Months later, Marcus stood before a classroom full of students from a dozen species, teaching the first course ever offered in human resonance studies. And when a young alien raised her hand and asked why the precursors had chosen humanity, Marcus smiled. "They did not choose us because we were special," he said. "They made us special because when they looked across all possible futures, they saw a species that would choose to stand together. That is not genetics or destiny or ancient programming. That is just being human." On his desk, the old sword sat dormant with its rust returned, sleeping until it would be needed again. But sometimes late at night when Marcus was alone, he swore he could see it flicker with golden light, a promise that the darkness might return, but the light would always be waiting to meet it.